last channel here, which is my favorite. I honestly didn't know what to kind of name this, but I wanted to call it out because it's something that has worked well for people and I think has great stories, and a lot of kind of great startups kind of like have a story around this. And so I just called it hustle, which is a very loose name. Let me give examples of this because this does not come in one single form. And so just let me give examples of this and then we can kind of talk about it a little bit. This is the most San Francisco startup idea I've ever heard of in my life. There was a startup when we were going through YC that I think was working on fighting parking tickets. So if you were in San Francisco and you got a parking ticket, you could take a picture of the parking ticket, upload the picture to the app, and they would help you fight it. And I don't think the startup isn't around and they probably moved into a different idea. But I remember hearing the story of how they validated this idea and how they started growing initially. And what that was I think in most cities it works this way, but there are parking ticket attendants. And so they go around the city and if they notice a car that is illegally parked, they will give them a ticket. So what these guys did is they woke up every morning and they drove into the city and then they tried to find a parking ticket attendant who typically are driving like a motorcycle or kind of like a moped or something, right? So every day they would drive into the city and they would find one. They would follow them throughout the day. And they would follow them throughout the day because this person is obviously writing parking tickets and their customers are people who get parking tickets. And so this person basically, as they thought about it, were like generating customers on a daily basis for them. And so they would just follow this person around. And what was interesting is these parking attendants would kind of go around a block and write tickets. And so once they wrote tickets for a parking, they would actually just stay around and wait for people to come out to their cars and find the parking tickets and then go talk to them and ask them about like, hey, do you want help fighting this ticket and all this kind of stuff. And that was just like very clever to me. And then for the growth thing that they started to do as they built on top of this is they would follow the parking ticket attendant around. When they would write the ticket, the parking ticket attendant would go off. They would actually go to the car, get the ticket, and staple their flyer to the ticket and be like, so you just got this ticket, and there's this flyer that says, hey, do you want help fighting this? Which again is just like so clever and kind of like interesting. And you're reaching people like right at the moment they have the problem. And I just thought that that was like, it's fantastic. It's like a great way to kind of get in front of people who kind of need what you're talking about. And it doesn't fall neatly into kind of like any of the other ones. I guess it's kind of like outreach, but it's significantly different enough. I just wanted to kind of call out this type of ideas. Okay, so that's one example. A second example I have is we talked to someone recently who was working on an eSIM business. And eSIMs, for people who don't know, is if you go to another country, you can do roaming and that costs a lot of money. And so what a lot of people do is they go to the airport and they buy a new SIM card for that country and then they use that throughout their travels. So this guy wants to do eSIMs, which means you can buy it online. You don't actually have to kind of have a physical SIM card. And he thought this was better than the existing stuff. So what he did is he went to his local airport, and there's always kind of a lot of booths who sell SIM cards. Every airport, it's at arrivals. You don't have to go through security. And he basically just stood next to the booths all the time. And when people bought SIM cards, he would walk up to them and be like, hey, why did you kind of buy this SIM card? How was the experience? If I could give it to you without kind of having to do this and you could do it before you leave, what would you like? What do you think of that? Like all of that kind of stuff. And so he would talk to people in that moment when they're kind of like buying it. Turns out he eventually got kicked out of the airport because the booths started complaining about him that they were like harassing his customers and like whatever and all of that kind of stuff, which he wasn't harassing them. It was like, there's nothing wrong with him. The booths probably just didn't like it. But I thought that was also kind of a great way to start talking to your customers. And in both of these cases, what I really, really like about these types of ideas is you are talking to real people at the moment that they are thinking about these problems or have these problems. And the quality of information that you get from them is just significantly better than, I don't know, somewhere else where they're kind of like not thinking about it. I don't know, they're sitting on their couch or like whatever it is, and they're not really kind of that engaged with it. And in both of these cases, you're going to where the people are, what they do now, and you're talking to them about it. So I think that's great. To go on to the pros, I don't know if this is a pro, but it's really novel when people do this. Again, this is not what you should be thinking about, but investors love hearing stories like this. And so I don't know, it's just kind of novel and makes great stories. I talked about people in the act. Again, I think just talking to people the moment that they have the problem at the time that they need a solution like that is like the prime time to be talking to people. So that's great. The third pro here is, and this is maybe you get this in a little bit of all of them, but if you do this, you learn unexpected things. And oftentimes the most valuable learnings that you get from validation are unexpected. And this is probably the highest signal way to kind of like generate these unexpected things. Okay, why do you learn unexpected things when you're kind of doing these? Well, since you are talking to people like at the moment they have the problem, you pick up on what is the environment that they're kind of in when they're doing that. Is there a lot of people? Is there not a lot of people? What is their kind of like state of mind when you're kind of doing it, right? So, okay, they just got off these flights, like, maybe for the SIM card, the eSIM business one, maybe they notice that everybody that gets to these sellers, they just got off long flights and they all kind of are stressed and look kind of like horrible, right? Like hard to get that in other places. And so you just have so much more kind of like implicit observations where you're like seeing these things happen in the real world. And so you just end up learning a lot of unexpected things as this kind of like goes on. And so I think this is like a really great way to do it. If you can figure out something that is kind of relevant to your startup. And I think this book kind of, maybe I'll kind of go to the cons. I don't know if these are cons as much as they're just make this one kind of like more difficult than the others, despite being quite valuable. Requires some creativity. You have to think about your idea and you have to kind of figure out, okay, well, what can I do to reach people who potentially want what I'm building and what my idea is? And so it requires a bit of creativity. It's not something you can just get off the shelf. Like paid marketing, it's versatile, it works. You can kind of just get it off the shelf. This one requires creativity. There's nothing that's off the shelf. The second one here, and I think in both of these cases, they're good examples of it. You've got to be comfortable with like doing something that is like a little bit out of the norm. People might look at you kind of weird. You might get kicked out of places. You just have to be kind of like comfortable with it in order to do that. And so I always think about this as really valuable kind of like learnings, but there's costs that you have to be paid and you have to kind of like think about these creative solutions and you have to be able to kind of like be weird. One thing I'll kind of say about both of these cons is as a founder, you often need both of these traits anyway. And so you're going to have to kind of grapple this one way or the other. So these are kind of great if you can kind of come up with them. So yeah, this is kind of a whole nother kind of class of way of generating traffic that people kind of think about quite a lot. Business types, it's both B2B and B2C. It really just comes down to how creative you are to make it fit. But I've seen versions of this for B2B startups, B2C startups, all of that kind of stuff. And so there's lots of ways that you can do this.